The wind howled through the cracks in the old barn, whistling like a lonesome spirit searching for warmth. Snow had piled high against the walls overnight, turning the world outside into a sea of white, silent and still. Lena Kincaid pulled her wool shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stepped out of the farmhouse, her breath curling in the frigid air. Winter had come early this year, and with it, a loneliness that settled deep in her bones. Her father had been gone for nearly a year now, and though she worked from dawn till dusk to keep the farm running, the emptiness of the house at night was harder to bear than any chore. She trudged through the snow toward the barn, her boots sinking with each step. The animals needed feeding, and if she didn't break the ice on the water trough soon, the cows would go thirsty. The heavy wooden door creaked as she pushed it open, letting in a gust of wind that made the horses shift in their stalls. She reached for the pitchfork, her fingers stiff with cold, when a sound made her freeze, a low, ragged breath, not from any animal she owned. There, in the far corner where the hay was piled deepest, lay a man. He was curled on his side, his coat too thin for the weather, his boots worn nearly through at the soles. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, and for one terrible moment, Lena thought he might already be dead. But then his chest rose slightly, and his fingers twitched against the straw. A stranger, half-frozen and desperate, had taken shelter in her barn. Her first instinct was to run for the sheriff. A lone woman couldn't be too careful, especially out here where neighbors were few and help was far. But something stopped her. Maybe it was the way his brow furrowed even in sleep, as if he were braced for a blow. Maybe it was the way his hands, though calloused and strong, were clenched like a man used to holding on with all he had. Or maybe it was the slip of paper that had fallen from his pocket, a letter, the edges frayed from being folded and unfolded too many times. She picked it up carefully, her eyes scanning the words. It was a reply to an advertisement, one of those mail-order bride notices folks put in the papers back east. This man, whoever he was, had written to a woman, offering his name, his labor, his promise. But the ink at the bottom of the page was fresh, added in a different hand. No answer came. She must have changed her mind. Lena's throat tightened. She knew what it was to be left waiting. For a long moment, she stood there, the cold seeping into her bones, the wind moaning outside. Then, with a resolve that surprised even her, she knelt beside the stranger and shook his shoulder gently. His eyes flew open, dark, wary, full of a fear she recognized. The fear of a man who expected the world to turn him away. "You'll die out here," she said, her voice steady. "Come inside." He stared at her, disbelief flickering in his gaze. Then slowly he nodded. And just like that, the quiet of the winter-buried farm was broken. The farmhouse had never felt so small as it did with a stranger sitting at her table. Lena busied herself with the kettle, the rhythmic clatter of spoon against tin filling the silence that stretched between them. Elias Ward, for that was his name, spoken in a voice rough from disuse and cold, sat stiffly in her father's old chair, his hands curled around the mug she'd given him, as if absorbing every bit of warmth they could. The fire in the hearth crackled, casting long shadows over the room, and outside, the wind still prowled around the eaves like a restless animal. She studied him when she thought he wouldn't notice. He was younger than she'd first guessed, perhaps only a few years older than herself, but life had etched lines into his face that didn't belong there yet. His dark hair was tangled from the road, his beard uneven where he'd tried to keep it trimmed with nothing but a knife. But his eyes, sharp and watchful beneath a furrowed brow, were the kind that missed nothing. They flicked to the rifle above the mantel, to the locked cupboard where her father had kept his accounts, to the single candle burning low on the table. A man used to measuring his surroundings then, used to knowing where the dangers lay. "You're welcome to the barn another night," Lena said at last, because the silence had grown too heavy. "But the cold's only getting worse. If you've nowhere else to go, you can sleep by the hearth." Elias's fingers tightened around the mug. "I don't aim to be a burden." "You won't be." The words came out quicker than she meant them to. She turned back to the stove, stirring the porridge more than it needed. "I've got chores enough for two, and this farm doesn't run itself. If you're willing to work, There's food and a roof in it for you. A pause. Then, quietly, why? It wasn't suspicion in his voice, not exactly. More like the wary confusion of a man who'd gone too long without kindness. Lena kept her back to him, watching the steam rise from the pot. She could have told him about the letter in her pocket, the one that proved he'd been left waiting just like she had. She could have said that a farm was too big for one person, that the nights were too long, that sometimes a body just needed another soul nearby to keep the loneliness at bay. But those were truths too raw to speak aloud. Instead, she shrugged. Winter's no time to turn a man out. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then he set the mug down carefully, though it's scraping against the table. I'll earn my keep. And just like that, the bargain was struck. By morning, the snow had stopped, leaving the world hushed and glittering under a pale sun. Lena found Elias already in the barn, mending a broken harness with hands that moved with practiced ease. He'd stacked fresh hay for the cows, cleared the ice from the trough, and even fixed the hinge on the chicken coop that had been loose since autumn. He worked like a man who didn't need to be told what to do, like someone who'd spent a lifetime making himself useful. It wasn't until midday that the first ripple of trouble came. Mrs. Hattie Boone arrived in her old wagon, her sharp eyes narrowing at the sight of Elias chopping wood by the shed. The widow had been bringing Lena pies and preserves since her father passed, fussing over her like a mother hen, and today was no different except for the way her gaze lingered on the stranger. "Who's that, then?" she asked, handing Lena a jar of pickled beets with a little more force than necessary. Lena took the jar, bracing herself. "Elias Ward. He's helping around the farm." "Is he now?" Mrs. Boone's voice was dry as kindling. "And where'd he come from?" "East." It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the whole truth either. Lena could feel the older woman's disapproval, like a physical weight. "He's just passing through." Mrs. Boone hummed, unconvinced. "Men like that don't pass through. They stay until they've taken what they want." She patted Lena's arm, her grip firm. "You mind yourself, girl. Not every stray deserves a place at the hearth." Lena watched her go, the wagon wheels crunching over the snow. When she turned back, Elias was still splitting logs, his shoulders tense beneath his coat. She wondered how much he'd heard. That evening, Sheriff Tom Riggs rode up to the porch, his badge gleaming dully in the fading light. He didn't dismount, just tipped his hat and gave Elias a long, measuring look. "Heard there was a new face around here." Lena stepped forward before Elias could speak. "He's working for me." The sheriff's gaze flicked between them, his mouth a tight line. "You know anything about him?" "Enough." She lifted her chin. "He's done nothing wrong." Tom sighed, rubbing a hand over his beard. "Lena, your daddy was a friend of mine. I'd hate to see you." "I'm not a child." The words came out sharper than she intended. "I can handle my own affairs." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Elias stepped forward, his voice quiet but clear. "I'll move on if that's what's best." Lena rounded on him. "No," she turned back to the sheriff. "He stays." Tom studied them both for a long moment. Then he nodded, though his eyes were still wary. "All right. But if there's trouble, you'll be the first to know," Lena finished. When the sheriff's horse had disappeared down the road, Elias let out a slow breath. "You didn't have to do that." Lena met his gaze. "I know." Inside, the fire burned low, casting the room in flickering gold. Outside, the first stars pricked through the winter sky. And for the first time in a long while, the farm didn't feel quite so alone. The days settled into a rhythm as the snow deepened around the farm. Each morning, Lena woke before dawn to find Elias already at work, his breath clouding in the brittle air as he hauled water from the well, his hands raw from mending fences buried under layers of ice. He spoke little, but his presence was as steady as the old oak by the creek, silent and unyielding against the wind. At first, Lena had watched him with cautious eyes, waiting for some sign that he might betray her trust. But as the sun rose and set over endless white fields, she found herself listening for the scrape of his boots on the porch steps, the low murmur of his voice when he spoke to the horses. The blizzard struck without warning. One moment, The sky was a dull, heavy gray. The next, snow came howling across the fields in great swirling sheets, swallowing the world whole. Lena barely had time to secure the chickens before the wind ripped the coop door from her hands, sending it clattering into the dark. She stumbled back toward the house, the cold biting at her cheeks like teeth, when a shape emerged from the storm. Elias, his coat crusted with ice, his arms full of firewood. "The north pasture fence is down," he shouted over the wind. "The cattle will bolt if we don't get them in." Lena nodded, her heart hammering. Together, they fought their way through the storm, the snow so thick it was like wading through water. The cows were huddled against the barn, their hides dusted white, their eyes rolling in fear. Elias moved among them like a man who'd done this before, his voice calm and firm as he herded them toward the safety of the barn. Lena's fingers were numb by the time the last animal was inside, her skirts frozen stiff around her legs. She turned to thank him only to see Elias already dragging the broken fence posts into place, his shoulders straining against the wind. That night, as the storm raged outside, they sat by the fire, wrapped in blankets, their hands curled around steaming mugs of bitter chicory coffee. The house groaned under the weight of the wind, the windows rattling like loose teeth. Lena watched the flames dance over Elias's face, casting shadows in the hollows of his cheeks. "You've done this before," she said at last. Elias stared into the fire. "Grew up on a farm. My father believed in hard work and short words." Lena traced the rim of her mug. "Where are they now?" "Gone." The word was flat, final. She didn't ask more. Some wounds were too deep to poke at, especially in the dark of winter. Instead, she reached for the quilt draped over the back of the chair, her mother's, stitched with patterns of stars and flowers, and handed it to him. Elias hesitated, then took it, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. "Thank you." The storm lasted 3 days. 3 days of hauling water from the well before it froze over, of breaking ice in the troughs, of huddling by the fire while the wind screamed outside. And through it all, Elias worked without complaint, his quiet strength as much a part of the farm now as the old stone hearth. But storms weren't the only danger. When the snow finally stopped, the town began to whisper. Jed Carter, the blacksmith, was the first to voice what others were thinking. He cornered Lena outside the mercantile, his broad face flushed with cold and something darker. "Heard you took in a stray," he said, his voice too loud. "Man shows up out of nowhere. Won't say where he's from. You really think that's wise?" Lena tightened her grip on her basket. "He's done nothing wrong." Jed snorted. "Yet. You know what they say about men like that. No past, no name, probably no honor either." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could speak, a shadow fell across them. Elias stood a few feet away, his face unreadable. He didn't say a word, didn't even look at Jed. But something in his stillness made the blacksmith step back, muttering under his breath as he walked away. That night, Lena found a folded piece of paper tucked under her door, a wanted poster. The ink smudged, the face on it blurred, but not quite unfamiliar. Her stomach twisted. Was this why Elias had run? Was this the shadow that clung to him? She didn't ask. Not then. But when she stepped outside at dawn, she found Elias packing his few belongings into a worn knapsack, his movements deliberate, his jaw set. "You're leaving," she said, her voice flat. Elias didn't look up. "It's for the best." The words hung between them, heavy as the snow-laden branches of the pine trees. Lena thought of the storm, of the way he'd stood between her and the wind without a second thought. She thought of the quiet evenings by the fire, of the way the farm no longer felt like it was swallowing her whole. She reached out, her fingers closing around his wrist. "Stay." Elias went still. For a long moment he didn't move. Then slowly he let the knapsack fall to the ground. And just like that, the storm inside her stilled too. The days grew longer, the snow receding like a reluctant guest, leaving behind mud and the first brave shoots of green pushing through the thawing earth. With the passing of winter's grip, the farm stirred to life again, but something else had shifted, too. Something quieter and harder to name. Lena found herself watching Elias more than she meant to, noting the way he tilted his head when listening to the wind in the trees, the way his hands, rough from work, could be startlingly gentle when mending a bird's broken wing or untangling a colt's knotted mane. He had become as much a part of the land as the old stone fence posts or the creek that ran along the property's edge, steady and silent. But the town's whispers had not faded with the snow. If anything, they grew louder, carried on the spring winds like seeds looking for barren soil to take root. Every trip to the mercantile meant sidelong glances. Every Sunday service meant polite but pointed questions from the women who had once been her mother's friends. A young woman living alone with a man not her kin. What would your father say? Their concern was a thin veil over something sharper, something that made Lena's hands curl into fists at her sides. Mrs. Boone, at least, had softened somewhat. She arrived one afternoon with a basket of early greens and a speculative gleam in her eye. "That man of yours fixed Widow Crenshaw's fence yesterday," she said, as if confessing a crime. "Didn't ask for a penny. Just did it and walked away." Lena hid a smile. "He's like that." Mrs. Boone huffed.
"Well,
"If he's staying, folks will talk less if there's a ring on your finger." The words hung in the air like smoke. Lena nearly dropped the plate she was drying. "It's not like that." "Isn't it?" Mrs. Boone arched a brow. "You think I don't see the way you look at him when he's not watching? The way he watches you when you are." She patted Lena's cheek, her touch surprisingly gentle. "Child, the heart doesn't care about propriety, but the world does." That night, Lena lay awake long after the fire had burned to embers, turning the idea over in her mind like a river stone. Marriage. A partnership, not just of land and labor, but of names, of futures. It made sense. In a practical way, Elias could inherit the farm if anything happened to her. No one could question his right to be there. But beneath that, a quieter, more treacherous thought whispered, "What if he says no?" She found him at first light, sharpening an axe by the woodpile. The rising sun painted the sky in hues of gold and pink, and for a moment, she just watched him, the way his shoulders moved beneath his shirt, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, damp with morning dew. Elias. He turned, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Something wrong?" Lena took a deep breath. "Marry me." The words landed between them like a struck match. Elias went utterly still, his eyes widening slightly. For a terrible moment, she thought he might laugh, or worse, walk away. But then he stepped closer, his voice low. "Lena, you don't have to." "I know." She lifted her chin. "But it makes sense. The farm needs both of us. The town, well, they'll talk either way, but this way they'll have less to grab onto." She hesitated, then added, softer, "And I don't want you to leave." Elias exhaled sharply, as if she'd knocked the breath from him. He studied her face for a long moment, his gaze searching. Then, slowly, he nodded. "If you're sure." "I'm sure." The simplicity of it should have felt anticlimactic, but instead, something warm and bright unfurled in Lena's chest. They stood there in the dawnlight, the air between them humming with something unspoken, something that felt like the first green shoot after a long winter tentative, but reaching for the sun. 2 days later, they stood before the preacher in Mrs. Boone's parlor, the scent of beeswax and lavender thick in the air. Lena wore her mother's dress, the fabric yellowed with age but still sturdy. Elias had scrubbed his hands clean and borrowed a coat from the sheriff, who stood as witness with grudging approval. The vows were simple, the kiss chastely brief, but when Elias's fingers tangled with hers as they stepped outside, Lena felt something inside her settle, as if a door long left unlatched had finally clicked shut. That night, they sat on the porch, sharing a slice of the cake Mrs. Boone had insisted on baking. The stars were bright overhead, the air sweet with the scent of turned earth and apple blossoms. Elias broke the silence first. "I never thought," he trailed off, staring at his hands. "I didn't expect to have this. Any of it." Lena leaned into his shoulder just slightly. "Neither did I." And for the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to fear, but something to step into together. Summer draped itself over the farm in a golden haze, the fields thick with wheat and the garden bursting with peas and carrots. The rhythm of their days had settled into something comfortable. Lena rose with the sun to tend the kitchen garden while Elias mended fences or took the wagon into town for supplies. The townsfolk had stopped whispering quite so loudly, though some still eyed Elias with suspicion when they thought he wasn't looking. But for the most part, life had taken on a quiet, sun-warmed peace. That peace shattered the day Micah Holt rode into the yard. Lena was hanging laundry when she heard the horse, a big, ill-tempered bay that stomped and snorted as its rider jerked it to a stop. The man in the saddle was broad-shouldered and unshaven, his hat pulled low over eyes that glittered with something sharp and unpleasant. He didn't dismount, just sat there, surveying the farm like a man calculating what it might fetch at auction. Well, he drawled. Look what the cat dragged in. Elias had been repairing the chicken coop, but at the sound of that voice, he went utterly still. When he turned, his face was a careful blank, but Lena saw the way his fingers tightened around the hammer. Micah. The name was flat, toneless, but Micah grinned like it was the warmest greeting he'd ever received. Heard you'd gone and got yourself hitched. Pretty little wife, nice bit of land. His gaze flicked to Lena, lingering in a way that made her skin crawl. Guess running suited you after all. Elias set the hammer down slowly. What do you want? Micah's smile didn't reach his eyes. What's mine? You skipped out on that debt back in Laramie, Ward. Thought you could just disappear? Lena's stomach clenched. A debt? Elias had never mentioned. There was no debt. Elias's voice was low, dangerous. You cheated every man at that table and you know it. Micah chuckled, patting his horse's neck. Funny how no one else remembers it that way. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. Now, I could take this up with the law. Or you could settle things quiet like, say, $50. The number hung in the air like a gunshot. $50 was nearly half a year's earnings. Lena's hands curled into fists at her sides. This wasn't about money. This was about a man who enjoyed watching others squirm. Elias took a step forward. Get off my land. Micah's grin faded. For a moment, the two men stared at each other, the air between them crackling with tension. Then, with a shrug, Micah straightened in the saddle. Suit yourself. But this ain't over. He wheeled his horse around, kicking up dust as he rode off, leaving silence in his wake. Lena waited until the sound of hoofbeats faded before turning to Elias. What was that? Elias exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Micah runs crooked card games. I worked for him a while back hauling freight, keeping the books. When I realized what he was doing, I quit. He didn't take kindly to it. And the debt. A lie. Elias's jaw tightened. But he's got friends in enough places to make trouble if he wants. Lena studied his face, the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed, as if bracing for a blow. This wasn't just about Micah. This was about the past Elias had tried to outrun, the shadows that had followed him all the way here. She reached out, her fingers brushing his. We'll handle it. Elias turned his hand to grip hers, his palm rough against hers. I don't want him anywhere near you. Lena squeezed back. Then we make sure he doesn't come back. That evening, they sat at the kitchen table, a single lantern casting long shadows across the room. Lena spread out the farm's accounts, every penny earned, every penny owed. Elias watched in silence as she tallied the numbers, her brow furrowed in concentration. We could pay him off, she said at last. Elias shook his head. He'll just come back for more. Lena tapped the ledger with her pencil. Then we go to Sheriff Riggs. If Micah's known for cheating, it's my word against his. And he's got more friends in high places than I do. Elias rubbed his temples. I should have told you. About all of it. Lena closed the ledger with a snap. It wouldn't have changed anything. Outside, the first fireflies of summer flickered in the gathering dark. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, low and mournful. Lena reached across the table, covering Elias's hand with hers. We'll figure it out, she said softly. And for the first time since Micah had ridden into their lives, Elias looked like he almost believed it. The confrontation with Micah Holt left a shadow over the farm, but the land had a way of demanding attention, pulling them forward into the rhythms of summer. The wheat grew tall, its golden stalks swaying in the breeze like a living sea, and the garden overflowed with tomatoes and beans that Lena canned in the sweltering kitchen, her sleeves rolled up and her hair sticking to her damp forehead. Elias worked from dawn until long after the fireflies appeared, his hands never idle, as if he could outrun the threat of Micah's return through sheer exhaustion. It was on one of those endless summer evenings, when the heat still clung to the earth even as the sun dipped below the horizon, that Finn appeared. Lena was carrying a basket of eggs back to the house when she saw him, a small, ragged figure hovering at the edge of the yard, his feet bare and his face smudged with dirt. He couldn't have been more than 8 or 9, his eyes too large for his thin face, his shoulders hunched, as if expecting a blow. When he noticed her watching, he froze like a rabbit caught in open ground. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Then Lena set the basket down and crouched, holding out a hand. "You hungry?" The boy hesitated, his gaze darting toward the road behind him, as if someone might be chasing him. But the road was empty, and the only sound was the distant call of a whippoorwill. Slowly, he nodded. Inside, Lena set a plate of cornbread and cold ham in front of him, then poured a glass of milk. Finn ate like he hadn't seen food in days, his small hands trembling slightly as he stuffed bites into his mouth too fast to chew properly. Elias came in from the barn just as the boy was licking crumbs from his fingers and stopped short in the doorway, his brow furrowing. Lena met his eyes. "This is Finn." Elias studied the boy, the way his ribs showed through his threadbare shirt, the way he shrank back slightly under the scrutiny. Without a word, Elias turned and rummaged in the cupboard, pulling out another slice of ham and setting it in front of Finn. The boy stared at it, then up at Elias, as if waiting for the trick. Elias just nodded toward the food.
"Eat."
Finn did, slower this time, his shoulders relaxing by degrees. When he was done, Lena filled a tin basin with warm water and handed him a cloth. "Where's your family?" Finn scrubbed at his face, leaving streaks of clean skin behind. "Ain't got none. Ma died last winter."
"Pa."
He trailed off, his fingers tightening around the cloth. "Ain't seen him in a while." Lena's chest ached. She glanced at Elias, who was leaning against the counter, his arms crossed. His expression was unreadable, but she knew what he was thinking. They'd both been alone in the world once. They knew what it was to have no one. Finn must have sensed the shift in the room, because he stiffened, his chin jutting out. "I can work. I ain't a beggar." Elias pushed away from the counter. "Barn needs sweeping." Finn blinked. "That all?" Elias almost smiled. "For tonight." And just like that, Finn became part of the farm. He slept in the hayloft at first, curled up in a nest of blankets Lena smuggled out to him, but after a week of watching him rub his eyes at breakfast, she cleared out the little room off the kitchen, the one that had been her father's study, and set up a cot. Finn touched the quilt she spread over it with something like reverence, his fingers tracing the stitched patterns. "You sure?" he asked, his voice small. Lena ruffled his hair. "Sure as sunrise." As the days passed, Finn filled the farm with a noise and energy it had lacked before. He chattered endlessly as he helped Elias mend fences, his small hands surprisingly deft with a hammer. He followed Lena around the garden, peppering her with questions about every plant and weed until she laughed and sent him off to collect eggs. In the evenings, he sat at the kitchen table, his tongue poking out in concentration as he practiced his letters on a slate Elias had dug out from the attic. Mrs. Boone took one look at him and declared him scrappy, which was high praise coming from her. She arrived one afternoon with a pair of boots that had belonged to her grandson and a jar of molasses cookies, which Finn accepted with wide-eyed awe. "Boy needs fattening up," she said to Lena, as if Finn couldn't hear. "And a proper haircut." Finn scowled, but he didn't refuse the cookies. Even Sheriff Riggs softened, though he made a show of grumbling about strays multiplying like rabbits when he stopped by to check on them. But Lena saw the way he slipped Finn a peppermint stick when he thought no one was looking, and the way his mustache twitched when Finn proudly showed off his newly learned cursive. The only shadow came one evening when Finn, half asleep at the table after a long day of helping Elias bring in the hay, mumbled, "You reckon Michael come back?" The name sent a chill through the room. Elias's hands stilled on the harness he was oiling. Lena set down her mending. Finn yawned, rubbing his eyes. "Just wonderin'." Elias's voice was quiet. "If he does, we'll handle it." Finn nodded, already drifting off. Lena carried him to bed, tucking the quilt around his shoulders. When she returned to the kitchen, Elias was staring out the window, his jaw tight. "He's just a boy," Lena said softly. "He worries." Elias turned to her, his eyes dark in the lamplight. "He shouldn't have to." Lena reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. Outside, the crickets sang, and the stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to the small lives below. But here, in this kitchen, with Finn's quiet snores drifting from the next room, the world felt solid. Safe. For now, at least, it was enough. The autumn air carried the scent of ripe apples and burning leaves as the town gathered for the Harvest Festival, the one day of the year when work paused and the whole community came together to celebrate the season's bounty. Lanterns hung from the branches of the old oak in the town square, their golden light spilling over tables laden with pies, smoked meats, and jars of honey. Fiddles played lively tunes while children darted between the stalls, their laughter ringing through the crisp evening air. Lena stood at the edge of the square, her hand resting lightly on Finn's shoulder as he bounced on his toes, eager to join the other boys in their games. He had grown taller over the summer, his face fuller, his eyes brighter. The haunted look he'd worn when he first arrived had faded, replaced by the easy confidence of a child who knew he was exactly where he belonged. "Go on," she said, giving him a gentle nudge. "But don't eat too much candy, or you'll be sick." Finn grinned and bolted into the crowd, his boots kicking up dust. Lena watched him go, her chest warm with something that felt an awful lot like pride. A hand slipped into hers, rough and familiar. Elias stood beside her, his face softened by the lantern light. He had traded his work shirt for a clean one, though his hair was still slightly tousled from where Finn had tugged at it earlier, demanding a piggyback ride. "You look beautiful," he murmured. Lena felt her cheeks heat. She had worn her mother's shawl, the blue one embroidered with tiny white flowers, and taken extra care with her braid. It was silly, perhaps, to fuss over her appearance for a town gathering, but tonight felt different. Tonight, for the first time, they weren't just Lena Kincaid and the stranger she'd taken in. They were the Wards of family. "Dance with me," Elias said. It wasn't a question. Before she could answer, he was leading her toward the makeshift dance floor, where couples spun and swayed to the music. Lena had never been much of a dancer. Her father had been too busy with the farm to teach her, and after he passed, there had been no one to ask. But Elias's hands were steady on her waist, his steps sure as he guided her through the movements. "When did you learn to dance?" she asked, breathless. Elias's lips quirked. "My mother made sure of it. Said no son of hers would embarrass himself at a social." The mention of his family was rare enough that Lena stilled for a moment, searching his face. But there was no pain there, not tonight, just quiet remembrance. Around them, the music swelled, the fiddles and banjos building to a joyful crescendo. Lena let herself be swept up in it, in the warmth of Elias's hands, in the laughter of the crowd, in the knowledge that Finn was safe and happy somewhere in the chaos. For the first time in so long, the future stretched before her not as something to fear, but as something bright and boundless. When the song ended, Mrs. Boone appeared, her arms laden with a bundle of cloth. "For you," she said, thrusting it at Lena. Lena unfolded it carefully. It was a quilt, stitched with careful, uneven seams, the patterns of stars and flowers she recognized from her mother's old designs, but interspersed with new shapes, a barn, a horse, even a small, lopsided figure that could only be Finn. "Finn helped," Mrs. Boone said gruffly. "Don't look so surprised. Boys got nimble fingers." Lena traced the stitches, her throat tight. "Thank you." Mrs. Boone waved her off, but her eyes were suspiciously bright. "None of that. Now go enjoy the evening." As night deepened, The festival showed no signs of slowing. Finn returned, sticky-fingered and yawning, leaning heavily against Elias's side. The preacher offered a blessing over the food and the harvest, his words carrying over the hushed crowd. And when he finished, he added, with a knowing smile toward Lena and Elias, "And may this winter bring warmth, not just to our hearths, but to our hearts." The ride home was quiet, Finn asleep in the back of the wagon, bundled in the new quilt. Overhead, the stars blazed, countless and unchanging. Elias guided the horses with one hand, the other resting on Lena's knee, his thumb tracing idle circles through the fabric of her dress. "Think Micah will ever come back?" Lena asked softly. Elias was silent for a long moment. Then, "Maybe. But it doesn't matter. We'll face it together." Together. The word settled over Lena like a promise. Whatever came, storms or strangers or shadows of the past, they would meet it as they had met everything else, side by side. The farm was dark when they arrived, but it was a welcoming dark, the kind that held the day's warmth in its walls. Elias carried Finn inside while Lena lit the lamps, their glow pushing back the night just enough. As she stood in the doorway, watching Elias tuck Finn into bed, she realized this was the forever she hadn't dared hope for. Not perfect, not easy, but hers. And it was only the beginning. Did this story warm your heart? Subscribe for more tales of love, resilience, and found family on the frontier. Click the bell icon to never miss a new chapter in life's great adventure. Your next favorite story is just a subscribe away. Join our community of readers who believe in second chances and happy endings. Drop a comment below, we'd love to hear what moved you most. And don't forget to share with someone who needs a little hope today. Until the next adventure, keep believing in the power of home.